Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Jennifer from Jen's World of Stitches and DPs, and we are going to record the second episode installation of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And where we left off, we were in the middle of the chapter 1. So we're gonna go ahead and continue with that. And those of you that are new, if you are coming into this, you can go back to the video that I recorded a week ago and catch up, and that way you're caught up. Okay, so we left off, and we were in Holmes and Watson were on a case, and we're going to go right to where we left off. A blow was struck, and in an instant, the lady who had stepped from her carriage was the center of a little knot of flushed and struggling men, who struck savagely at each other with their fists and sticks. Holmes dashed into the crowd to protect the lady, but just as he reached her, he gave a cry and dropped to the ground with the blood running freely down his face. At his fall, the guardsmen took to their heels in one direction and the loungers in the other, while a number of better dressed people who had watched the scuffle without taking part in it crowded in to help the lady and to attend to the injured man. Irene Adler, as well as I will still call her, had hurried up the steps, but she stood at the top with her superb figure outlined against the lights of the hall, looking back into the street. "Is the poor gentleman much hurt?" she asked. "He's dead," cried several voices. No, there's life in him," shouted another, "but he'll be gone before you can get him to the hospital." "He is a brave fellow," said a woman. "They would have had the lady's purse and watch if it hadn't been for him. They were a gang, and a rough one, too. Ah, he's breathing now. He can't lie in the street. May we bring him in?" "Marm, surely. Bring him into the sitting room. There is a comfortable sofa. This way, please." Slowly and solemnly he was borne into Binary Lodge and laid out in the principal room, while I still observed the proceedings from my post by the window. The lamps had been lit, but the blinds had not been drawn, so that I could see Holmes as he lay upon the couch. I did not know whether he was seized with compunction at that moment for the part he was playing, but I know that I never felt more heartily ashamed of myself in my life than when I saw the beautiful creature against whom I was conspiring, or the grace and kindliness with which she waited upon the injured man. And yet it would be the blackest treachery to Holmes to draw back now from the part which he instructed to me. I hardened my heart and took the smoke rocket from under my ulster. After all, I thought, we're not injuring her. We are but preventing her from injuring another. Holmes had sat upon the couch, and I saw him motion like a man who is in need of air. A maid rushed across and threw open the window. At that same instant I saw him raise his hand, and at the signal I tossed my rocket into the room with a cry of "Fire!" The word was no sooner out of my mouth than the whole crowd of spectators, well dressed and ill, gentlemen, ulsters, and servant maids, jumped in a general shriek of fire. Thick clouds of smoke curled through the room and out the open window. I caught a glimpse of rushing figures, and a moment later the voice of Holmes from within assuring him that it was a false alarm. Slipping through the crowd, I made my way to the corner of the street, and in 10 minutes was rejoiced to find my friend's arm in mine, and to get away from the scene of uproar. He walked swiftly, and in silence for some few minutes until we turned down on one of the quiet streets which lead towards the Edgware Road. "You did it very nicely, Doctor," he remarked. "Nothing could have been better. Is it all right? You have the photograph?" "I know where it is." "And how did you find out?" "She showed me, as I told you she would." "I'm still in the dark." "I do not wish to make a mystery," he said, laughing. "The matter was perfectly simple. You, of course, saw that everyone in the street was an accomplice. They were all engaged for the evening. I guessed as much. Then when the row broke out, I had a little moist red paint in the palm of my hand. I reached forward, fell down, and clapped my hand to my face. It became a piteous spectacle. It is an old trick. That also I could fathom. Then they carried me in, so she was bound to have me in. What else could she do? And into her sitting room, which was the very room which I suspected. It lay between that and her bedroom, and I was determined to see which. They laid me on a couch. I motioned for air. They were compelled to open the window, and you had your chance. How did that help you? It is all important. When a woman thinks that her house is on fire, her instinct is at once to rush to the thing which she values the most. It is a perfectly overpowering impulse, and I have more than once taken advantage of it, in the case of the Darlington substitution scandal, as it was of use to me, and also in the Arnsworth Castle business. A married woman grabs at her baby. An unmarried one reaches for her jewel box. Now it was clear to me that Our Lady of today had nothing in the house more precious to her than what we are in quest of. She would rush to secure it. The alarm of the fire was admirably done. The smoke and shouting were enough to shake nerves of steel. She responded beautifully. The photograph is in a recess behind a sliding panel just above the right bell pull. She was there in an instant, and I caught a glimpse of it as she half drew it out. When I cried out that it was a false alarm, she replaced it, glanced at the rocket, rushed from the room, and I have not seen her since. I rose, and making my excuses, escaped from the house. I hesitated whether to attempt to secure the photograph at once, but the coachman had come in, and as he was watching me narrowly, it seemed safer to wait. A little over participants may ruin all. And now, I asked, our quest is practically finished. I shall call with the king tomorrow, and with you, if you care to come with us. We will be shown into the sitting room to wait for the lady, but it is probable that when she comes, she may find neither us nor the photograph. It may be a satisfaction to His Majesty to regain it with his own hands. And when will you call? At 8 in the morning. She will not be up, so that we will have a clear field. Besides, we must be prompt, for this marriage may mean a complete change in her life and habits. I must wire to the king without delay. We had reached Baker Street and had stopped at the door. He was searching his pockets for the key when someone passing by said, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." There were several people on the pavement at the time, but the greeting appeared to come from a slim youth in an ulster who had hurried by. "I've heard that voice before," said Holmes, staring down the dimly lit street. "Now I wonder who the deuce could have been." I slept at Baker Street that night, and we were engaged upon our toast and coffee in the morning, when the King of Bohemia rushed into the room. "You have really got it?" he cried, grasping Sherlock Holmes by either shoulder and looking eagerly into his face. "Not yet. But you have hopes?" "I have hopes." "Then come. I am all impatient to be gone. We must have a cab." "No, my Brahmin is waiting." "Then that will simply simplify matters." We descended and started off once more for Binary Lodge. "Irene Adler is married," remarked Holmes. "Married? When?" "Yesterday." "But to whom?" "To an English lawyer named Norton." "But she could not love him." I am in hopes that she does." "And why in hopes?" "Because it would spare your Majesty all fear of future annoyance. If the lady loves her husband, she does not love your Majesty. If she does not love your Majesty, then there's no reason why she should interfere with your Majesty's plan." "It is true. And yet, well, I wish she had been of my own station. What a queen she would have made." He relapsed into a moody silence, which was not broken until we drew up on Serpentine Avenue. The door of Binary Lodge was open, and an elderly woman stood upon the steps. She watched us with a sardonic eye as we stepped from the Brahmin. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I believe?" she said. "Yes, I am Mr. Holmes," answered my companion, looking at her with a questioning and rather startled gaze. "Indeed, my mistress told me that you were likely to call. She left this morning with her husband by the 5:15 train from Charing Cross for the continent. What? Sherlock Holmes staggered back, white with chagrin and surprise. Do you mean that she has left England, never to return? And the papers? Asked the king hoarsely. All is lost. We shall see. He pushed past the servant, rushed into the drawing room, followed by the king and myself. The furniture was scattered about in every direction, with dismantled shelves and open drawers, as if the lady had hurriedly ransacked them before her flight. Holmes rushed at the bell pull, tore back a small sliding shutter, and plunged in his hand, pulled out a photograph and a letter. The photograph was of Irene Adler herself in an evening dress. The letter was superscribed to Sherlock Holmes, Esquire, to be left till called for. My friend tore it open, and we all three read it together. It was dated at midnight of the preceding night, and ran in this way. My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you did it very well. You took me in completely. Until after the alarm of fire, I had not a suspicion. But then when I found how I had betrayed myself, I began to think. I had been warned against you months ago. I had been told that if the king employed an agent, it would certainly be you, and your address had been given me. Yet with all this, you made me reveal what you wanted to know. Even after I became suspicious, I found it hard to think evil of such a dear, kind old clergyman. But you know, I have been trained as an actress myself. Male costume is nothing new to me. I often take advantage of the freedom which it gives. I sent John the coachman to watch you, ran upstairs, got into my walking clothes, as I call them, and came down just as you departed. When I followed you to your door, and so made sure that I was really an object of interest to the celebrated Mr. Sherlock Holmes, then I rather imprudently wished you good night, and started for the temple to see my husband. We both thought of the best resource was flight, when pursued by so formidable an antagonist, so you will find the nest empty when you call tomorrow. As to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than he. The king may do what he will without hindrance from one whom he has cruelly wronged. I keep it only to safeguard myself, and to preserve a weapon which will always secure me from any steps which he might take in the future. I lead a photograph which he might care to possess, and I remain, dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, very truly yours, Irene Norton Adler. What a woman! Oh, what a woman! Cried the King of Bohemia, when we had all three read this epistle. Did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she not have made an admirable queen? It is not a pity that she was not on my level. From what I have seen of the lady, she seems indeed to be on a very different level to your Majesty, said Holmes coldly. I'm sorry that I have not been able to bring your Majesty's business to a more successful conclusion. On the contrary, my dear sir, cried the King, nothing could be more successful. I know that her word is inviolable. The photograph is now as safe as if it were in the fire. I'm glad to hear your Majesty say so. I am immensely indebted to you. Pray tell me in what way I can reward you. This ring? He slipped an emerald snake ring from his finger and held it upon the palm of his hand. Your Majesty has something which I should value even more highly, said Holmes. You have it, but to name it. This photograph. The King stared at him in amazement. Irene's photograph? He cried. Certainly, if you wish. I thank your Majesty. Then there is no more to be done in the matter. I have the honor to wish you a very good morning. He bowed, and turning away without observing the hand which the King had stretched out to him, he set off in my company for his chambers. And that was how a great scandal threatened to affect the kingdom of Bohemia, and how the best plans of Mr. Sherlock Holmes were beaten by a woman's wit. He used to make merry over the cleverness of women, but I have not heard him to do it of late. And when he speaks of Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, it is always under the honorable title of The Woman. Chapter 2. Adventure the Red-Headed League. I had called upon my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes one day in the autumn of last year, and found him in deep conversation with a very stout, florid-faced, elderly gentleman with fiery red hair. With an apology for my intrusion, I was about to withdraw when Holmes pulled me abruptly into the room and closed the door behind me. "You could not possibly come at a better time, my dear Watson," he said cordially. "I was afraid that you were engaged." "So I am, very much so." "Then I can wait in the next room." "Not at all. This gentleman, Mr. Wilson, has been my partner and helper in many of my most successful cases, and I have no doubt that he will be the utmost use to me and yours also." The stout gentleman half rose from his chair and gave a bob of greeting, which, with a quick little questioning glance from his small, fat, encircled eyes. "Try the settee," said Holmes, relapsing into his armchair and putting his fingertips together, as was his custom when in judicial modes. "I know, my dear Watson, that you share my love of all that is bizarre and outside the conventions and humdrum routine of everyday life. You have shown your relish for it by the enthusiasm which has prompted you to chronicle, and if you will, excuse my saying so, somewhat to embellish so many of my own little adventures." "Your cases have indeed been of the greatest interest to me," I observed. "You will remember that I remarked the other day, just before we went into the very simple problem presented by Miss Mary Southard, that for strange effects and extraordinary combinations we must go to life itself, which is always far more daring than any effort of the imagination. A proposition which I took the liberty of doubting." "You did, Doctor, but none the less you must come round to my view, for otherwise I shall keep on piling fact upon fact on you until your reason breaks down under them and acknowledges me to be right. Now, Mr. Jabez Wilson has been good enough to call upon me this morning to begin a narrative which promises to be one of the most singularly which I have listened to for some time. You have heard me remark that the strangest and most unique things are very often connected, not with the larger, but with the smaller crimes, and occasionally indeed where there is room for doubt whether any positive crime has been committed. As far as I have heard, it is impossible for me to say whether the present case is an instance of crime or not, but the course of events is certainly among the most singular that I have ever listened to. Perhaps, Mr. Wilson, you would have the greatest kindness to recommence your narrative. I ask you not merely because my friend Dr. Watson has not heard the opening part, but also because the peculiar nature of the story makes me anxious to have every possible detail from your lips. As a rule, when I have heard some slight indications of the course of events, I am able to guide myself by the thousands of other similar cases which occur to my memory. In the present instance, I am forced to admit that the facts are, to the best of my belief, unique." The portly client puffed at his chest with an appearance of some little pride, and pulled a dirty and wrinkled newspaper from the inside pocket of his greatcoat. As he glanced down the advertisement column, with his head thrust forward and the paper flattened out upon his knee, I took a good look at the man and endeavored, after the fashion of my companion, to read the indications which might be presented by his dress or his appearance. I did not gain very much, however, by my inspection. Our visitor bore every mark of being an average, commonplace British tradesman, obese, pompous, and slow. He wore rather baggy gray shepherd's check trousers, a not over clean black frock coat, unbuttoned in the front, and a drab waistcoat with a heavy brassy Albert chain, and a square pierced bit of metal dangling down as an ornament. A frayed top hat and a faded brown overcoat with a wrinkled velvet collar lay upon a chair beside him. Altogether, I look as I would, there was nothing remarkable about the man, save his blazing red head, and the expression of extreme chagrin and discontent upon his features. Sherlock Holmes' quick eye took in my occupation. and he shook his head with a smile as he noticed my questioning glances. Beyond the obvious facts that he has at some time done manual labor, that he takes snuff, that he is a Freemason, that he has been in China, and that he's done considerable amount of writing lately, I can deduce nothing else. Mr. Jabez Wilson started up in his chair, with his forefinger upon the paper, but his eyes upon my companion. "How in the name of good fortune did you know all of that, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "How did you know, for example, that I did manual labor?" "It's true as gospel, for I began as a ship's carpenter." "Your hands, my dear sir. Your right hand is quite a size larger than your left. You have worked with it, and the muscles are more developed. Well, the snuff, then, and the Freemasonry? I won't insult your intelligence by telling you how I read that, especially as rather against the strict rules of your order, you use an arc and compass breastpin." "Ah, of course, I forgot that. But the writing? What else can be indicated by that right cuff, so very shiny for 5 inches, and the left one with the smooth patch near the elbow where you rested upon the desk?" "Well, but China? The fish that you have tattooed immediately above your right wrist could have been done in China. I have made a small study of tattoo marks, and have even contributed to the literature of the subject. That trick of staining the fish's scales of a delicate pink is quite peculiar to China. When in addition I see a Chinese coin hanging from your watch chain, the matter becomes even more simple." Mr. Jabez Wilson laughed heavily. "Well, I never," he said. "I thought at first that you had done something clever, but I see that there was nothing in it after all." "I began to think, Watson," said Holmes, "that I make a mistake in explaining. Amon ignotorum pro magnifico, you know, and my poor little reputation, such as it is, will suffer shipwreck if I am so candid. Can you not find the advertisement, Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, I have got it now," he answered, with a thick red finger planted, got something in my eye, planted halfway down the column. "Here it is. This is what began it all. You just read it for yourself, sir." I took the paper from him and read as follows: "To the Red-Headed League. On account of the bequest of the late Ezekiah Hopkins of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, USA, there is now another vacancy opened which entitles a member of the League to a salary of £4 a week for purely nominal services. All red-headed men who are in sound body and mind, above the age of 21 years, are eligible. Apply in person on Monday at 11 o'clock to Duncan Ross at the offices of the League, 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street." "What on earth does this mean?" I ejaculated after I had twice read over the extraordinary announcement. Holmes chuckled and wriggled in his chair, as was his habit when in high spirits. "It is a little off the beaten track, isn't it?" he said. "And now, Mr. Wilson, off you go at scratch and tell us all about it yourself, your household, and the effect which this advertisement has had upon your fortunes. You will first make note, Doctor, of the paper and the date." "It is the Morning Chronicle of April 27th, 1890, just 2 months ago." "Very good. Now, Mr. Wilson." "Well, it is just as I've been telling you, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Jabez Wilson, mopping his forehead. "I have a small pawnbroker's business at Coburg Square, near the city. It's not a very large affair, and of late years it has not done more than just give me a living. I used to be able to keep 2 assistants, but now I only keep 1, and I would have a job to pay him, but that he is willing to come for half wages so as to learn the business." "What is the name of this obliging youth?" asked Mr. Holmes. "His name is Vincent Spaulding, and he's not such a youth either. It's hard to say his age. I should not wish a smarter assistant, Mr. Holmes, and I know very well that he could better himself and earn twice what I am able to give him. But after all, if he is satisfied, why should I put ideas in his head?" "Why, indeed?" You seem most fortunate in having an employee who comes under the full market price. It is not a common experience among employers in this age. I don't know that your assistant is not as remarkable as your advertisement. Oh, he has his faults too, said Mr. Wilson. Never was such a fellow for photography. Snapping away with a camera when he ought to be improving his mind. And then diving down into a cellar like a rabbit into his hole to develop his pictures. That is his main fault. But on the whole, he's a good worker. There's no vice in him. He's still with you, I presume? Yes, sir. He and a girl of 14 who does a bit of simple cooking and keeps the place clean. That's all I have in the house. For I am a widower and never had any family. We live very quietly, sir, the three of us, and we keep a roof over our heads and pay our debts, if we do nothing more. The first thing that put us out was the advertisement. Spaulding, he came down into the office just this day, 8 weeks, with this very paper in his hands, and he says, I wish to the Lord, Mr. Wilson, that I was a red-headed man. Why that, I asks. Why, he says, here's another vacancy on the League of the Red-Headed Men. It's worth quite a little fortune to any man who gets it, and I understand that there are more vacancies than there are men, so that the trustees are at their wits' end what to do with the money. If my hair would only change color, here's a nice little crib all ready for me to step into. Why, what is it then? I asked. You see, Mr. Holmes, I'm a very stay-at-home man, and as my business came to me instead of my having to go for it, I was often weeks on end without putting my foot over the doormat. In that way, I didn't know much of what was going on outside, and I was always glad of a bit of news. Have you ever heard of the League of the Red-Headed Men? He asked with his eyes open. Never. Why, I wonder at that, for you are eligible yourself for one of his vacancies. And what are they worth? I asked. Oh, merely a couple of hundred a year, but the work is slight, and it need not interfere very much with one's occupations. Well, you can easily think that made me prick up my ears, for the business has not been over good for some years, and an extra couple of hundred would have been very handy. Tell me all about it, I said. Well, he said, showing me the advertisement. You can see for yourself that the League has a vacancy, and there is the address where you should apply for particulars. As far as I can make out, the League was founded by an American millionaire, Ezekiah Hopkins, who was very peculiar in his ways. He was himself a redhead, and he had great sympathy for all red-headed men. So when he died, it was found that he had left his enormous fortune in the hands of trustees, with the instructions to apply the interest to the providing of easy berths to men whose hair is of that color. From all I hear, it is splendid pay and very little to do. But, I said, there would be millions of red-headed men who would apply. Not so many as you might think, he answered. You see, it is really confined to Londoners and to grown men. This American had started from London when he was young, and he wanted to do the old town a good turn. Then again, I have heard it is no use your applying if your hair is light red or dark red or anything but real bright, blazing, fiery red. Now, if you cared to apply, Mr. Wilson, you would just walk in, but perhaps it would hardly be worth your while to put yourself out of the way for the sake of a few £100. Now, it is a fact, gentlemen, that you may see for yourselves that my hair is of a very full and rich tint, so that it seemed to me that if there was to be any competition in the matter, I stood as good a chance as any man that I ever met. Vincent Spaulding seemed to know so much about it that I thought he might prove useful. So I just ordered him to put up the shutters for the day and to come right away with me. He was very willing to have a holiday, so we shut the business up and started off for the address that was given us in the advertisement. I never hope to see such a sight as that again, Mr. Holmes. From north, south, east, and west, every man who had a shade of red in his hair had tramped into the city to answer the advertisement. Fleet Street was choked with red-headed folk, and Pope's Court looked like a coaster's orange barrel. I should not have thought there were so many in the whole country as were brought together by that single advertisement. Every shade of color they were: straw, lemon, orange, brick, Irish setter, liver, clay. But as Spaulding said, there were not many who had the real vivid flame colored tint. When I saw how many were waiting, I would have given it up in the despair, but Spaulding would not hear of it. How he did it I cannot imagine, but he pushed and pulled and butted until he got me through the crowd, right up to the steps which led to the office. There was a double stream upon the stair, some going up in hope, some coming back dejected. But we wedged in as well as we would and soon found ourselves in the office. Your experience has been the most entertaining one, remarked Holmes, as his client paused and refreshed his memory with a pinch of snuff. Pray continue your very interesting statement. There was nothing in the office but a couple of wooden chairs and a deal table, behind which sat a small man with a head that was even redder than mine. He said a few words to each candidate as he came up. Then he always managed to find some fault in them which would disqualify them. Getting a vacancy didn't seem to be such a very easy matter after all. However, when our turn came, the little man was much more favorable to me than to any of the others, and he closed the door as we entered so that he might have a private word with us. This is Mr. Jabez Wilson, said my assistant, and he is willing to fill a vacancy in the league, and he is admirably suited for it. The other answered, he has every requirement. I cannot recall when I have seen anything so fine. He took a step backward, cocked his head on one side, and gazed at my hair until I felt quite bashful. Then suddenly he plunged forward, wrung my hand, and congratulated me warmly on my success. It would be an injustice to hesitate, he said. You will, however, I'm sure, excuse me for taking an obvious precaution. With that, he seized my hair in both his hands and tugged until I yelled in pain. There is water in your eyes, he said, as he released me. I perceive that all is as it should be. But we have to be careful, for we have twice been deceived by wigs and once by paint. I could tell you tales of cobbler's wax, which would disgust you with human nature. He stepped over to the window and shouted through it at the top of his voice that the vacancy was filled. A groan of disappointment came from below, and the folk all trooped away in different directions until there was not a red head to be seen except my own and that of the manager. My name, he said, is Mr. Duncan Ross, and I myself am one of the pensioners upon the fund left by our noble benefactor. Are you a married man, Mr. Wilson? Have you a family? I answered that I had not. His face fell immediately. Dear me, he said gravely, this is very serious indeed. I'm sorry to hear you say that. The fund was, of course, for the propagation and spread of redheads as well as for their maintenance. It's exceedingly unfortunate that you should be a bachelor. My face lengthened at this, Mr. Holmes, for I thought that I was not to have the vacancy after all. But after thinking it over for a few minutes, he said that it would be all right. In the case of another, he said, the objection might be fatal. But we must stretch a point in favor of a man with such a head of hair as yours. When shall you be able to enter upon your new duties? Well, it is a little awkward, for I have a business already, I said. Oh, never mind about that, Mr. Wilson, said Vincent Spaulding. I should be able to look after that for you. What would be the hours? I asked. 10 to 2. Now, a pawnbroker's business is mostly done of an evening, Mr. Holmes, especially Thursday and Friday evening, which is just before payday. So it would suit me very well to earn a little in the mornings. Besides, I knew that my assistant was a good man, and that he would see to anything that turned up. That would suit me very well, I said. And the pay is £4 a week, and the work, it's purely nominal. What do you call purely nominal? Well, you have to be in the office at least in the building the whole time. If you leave, you forfeit your whole position forever. The will is very clear upon that point. You don't comply with the conditions if you budge from the office during that time. It's only 4 hours a day, and I should not think of leaving, I said. No excuse will avail, said Mr. Duncan Ross. Neither sickness nor business nor anything else. There you must stay or lose your billet. And the work is to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica. This is the first volume of that in the press. You must find your own ink, pens, and blotting paper. But we provide this table and chair. Will you be ready tomorrow? Certainly, I answered. Then goodbye, Mr. Jabez Wilson, and let me congratulate you once more on the important position which you have been fortunate enough to gain. He bowed me out of the room, and I went home with my assistant, hardly knowing what to say or do. I was so pleased at my good fortune. Well, I thought over the matter all day, and by evening I was in low spirits again, for I had quite persuaded myself that the whole affair must be some great hoax or fraud, though what its object might be I could not imagine. It seemed altogether past belief that anyone could make such a will, or that they would pay such a sum for doing anything so simple as copying out the Encyclopedia Britannica. Vincent Spaulding did what he could to cheer me up, but by bedtime I had reasoned myself out of the whole thing. However, in the morning I was determined to have a look at it anyhow. So I bought a penny bottle of ink with a quill pen and 7 sheets of full scrap paper. I started off for Pope's Court. Well, to my surprise and delight, everything was as right as possible. The table was set out, ready for me, and Mr. Duncan Ross was there to see that I got fairly to work. He started me off upon the letter A, and then he left me. But he would drop by from time to time to see that all was right with me. At 2 o'clock he bade me good day, complimented me upon the amount that I had written, and locked the door to the office after me. This went on day after day, Mr. Holmes, and on Saturday the manager came and planked down 4 golden sovereigns for my week's work. It was the same next week, and the same the week after. Every morning I was there at 10, and every afternoon I left at 2. By degrees Mr. Duncan Ross came to coming in only once of a morning, and then after a time he did not come in at all. Still, of course, I never dared to leave the room for an instant, for I was not sure when he would come. And then the billet was such a good one, and suited me so well, that I would not risk the loss of it. 8 weeks passed away like this, and I had written about abbots, archery, armor and architecture, and Attica, and hoped with diligence that I might get on the bees before very long. It cost me something in foolscap, and I had pretty nearly filled a shelf with my writings. And then suddenly the whole business came to an end. To an end? Yes, sir. And no later than this morning I went to my work as usual at 10 o'clock, but the door was shut and locked, with a little square of cardboard hammered on it to the middle of the panel with a tack. Here it is. You can read for yourself. He held up a piece of white cardboard paper about the size of a sheet of notebook paper, or note paper. In it read in this fashion: The Red-Headed League is dissolved. October 9, 1890. Sherlock Holmes and I surveyed this curt announcement and the rueful face behind it until the comical side of the affair so completely overtopped every other consideration that we both burst out into a roar of laughter. I cannot see that there is anything very funny, cried our client, flushing up to the roots of his flaming head. If you can do nothing better than laugh at me, I can go elsewhere. No, no, cried Holmes, shoving him back into the chair from which he had half risen. I really wouldn't miss your case for the world. It is most refreshingly unusual. But there is, if you will, excuse my saying so, something just a little funny about it. Pray, what steps did you take when you found the card upon the door? I was staggered, sir. I didn't know what to do. Then I called the offices round, but none of them seemed to know anything about it. Finally, I went to the landlord, who was an accountant living on the ground floor, and I asked him if he could tell me what had become of the Red-Headed League. He said that he had never heard of any such body. Then I asked him who Mr. Duncan Ross was. He answered that the name was new to him. Well, I said, the gentleman at number 4. What? The red-headed man? Yes. Oh, said he. His name was William Morris. He was a solicitor and was using my room as a temporary convenience until his new premises were ready. He moved out yesterday. Where could I find him? Oh, at his new offices. He did tell me the address. Yes, 17 King Edward Street, near St. Paul's. I started off, Mr. Holmes, but when I got to that address, it was a manufactory of artificial kneecaps, and no one in it had ever heard of either Mr. William Morris or Mr. Duncan Ross. And what did you do then? Asked Mr. Holmes. I went home to Saxe-Coburg Square, and I took the advice of my assistant, but he could not help me in any way. He could only say that if I had waited, I should hear by post. But that was not quite good enough, Mr. Holmes. I did not wish to lose such a place without a struggle. So as I had heard that you were good enough to give advice to poor folk who were in need of it, I came right away to you. And you did it very wisely, said Mr. Holmes. Your case is an exceedingly remarkable one, and I shall be happy to look into it. From what you have told me, I think that it's possible that graver issues hang from it than might at first sight appear. Grave enough? said Mr. Jabez Wilson. Why, I lost £4 a week. As far as you are personally concerned, remarked Holmes, I do not see that you have any grievance against this extraordinary league. On the contrary, you are, as I understand, richer by some £30, to say nothing of the minute knowledge which you have gained on every subject which comes under the letter A. You have lost nothing by them. No, sir. But I want to find out about them, and who they are, and what their object was in playing this prank, if it was a prank, upon me. It was a pretty expensive joke for them, for it cost them £32. We shall endeavor to clear up these points for you. And first, 1 or 2 questions, Mr. Wilson. This assistant of yours who first called your attention to the advertisement, how long had he been with you? About a month then. How did he come? In an answer to an advertisement. Was he the only applicant? No, I had a dozen. Why did he pick you? Or why did you pick him? Because he was handy and would come cheap. At half wages, in fact? Yes. What is he like, this Vincent Spaulding? Small, stout built, very quick in his ways, no hair on his face, though he's not short of 30, has a white splash of acid upon his forehead. Holmes sat up in his chair in considerable excitement. I thought as much, he said. Have you ever observed that his ears are pierced for earrings? Yes, sir. He told me that a gypsy had done it for him when he was a lad. Said Holmes, sinking back in thought. He is still with you? Oh, yes, sir. I have only just left him. And has your business been attended to in your absence? Nothing to complain of, sir. There's never very much to do of a morning. That will do, Mr. Wilson. I should be happy to give you an opinion upon the subject in a course of a day or 2. Today is Saturday, and I hope that by Monday we may come to a conclusion. Well, Watson, said Holmes, when our visitor had left us, what do you make of it all? I make nothing of it, I answered frankly. It is most a mysterious business. As a rule, said Holmes, the more bizarre is a thing is the less mysterious it proves to be. It is your commonplace, featureless crimes which are really puzzling, just as a commonplace face is most difficult to identify. But I must be prompt over this matter. What are you going to do then? I asked. To smoke, he answered. It is quite a 3-pipe problem, and I beg that you won't speak to me for 50 minutes. He curled himself up in his chair with his thin knees drawn up to his hawk-like nose, and there he sat with his eyes closed and some black clay pipe thrusting out like the bill of some strange bird. I had come to the conclusion that he had dropped asleep, and indeed was nodding myself, when he suddenly sprang out of his chair with the gesture of a man who had made up his mind and put his pipe down upon the mantelpiece. Sarah sat pleased at the St. James Hall this afternoon, he remarked. What do you think, Watson? Could your patients spare you for a few hours? I have nothing to do today. My practice is never very absorbing. Then put on your hat and come. I'm going through the city first, and we can have some lunch on the way. I observe that there is a good deal of German music on the program, which is rather more to my taste than the Italian or French. Introspective, and I want to introspect. Come along. We traveled by the Underground as far as Aldersgate, and a short walk took us to Saxe-Coburg Square, the scene of a singular story which we had listened to in the morning. It was a poky, little shabby genteel place, where 4 lines of dingy 2-story brick houses looked out into a small railed enclosure where a lawn of weedy grass and a few clumps of faded laurel bushes made a hard fight against a smoke-laden and uncongenial atmosphere. 3 gilt balls had and a brown board with Jabez Wilson in white letters upon a corner house announced this place where a red-headed client carried on his business. Sherlock Holmes stopped in front of it with his head on one side and looked it all over, and his eyes shining brightly between puckered lips. Then he walked slowly up the street, then down again to the corner, still looking keenly at the houses. Finally he returned to the pawnbroker's, and having thumped vigorously upon the pavement with a stick 2 or 3 times, he went up to the door and knocked. It was instantly opened by a bright-looking, clean-shaven young fellow who asked him to step in. "Thank you," said Holmes. "I only wished to ask how you would go from here to the Strand." "3rd right, 4th left," answered the assistant, promptly closing the door. "Smart fellow that," observed Holmes as we walked away. "He is, in my judgment, the 4th smartest man in London, and for daring, I'm not sure that he has not a claim to be a 3rd. I have known something of him before." "Evidently," I said. "Mr. Wilson's assistant counts for a good deal in this mystery of the Red-Headed League. I am sure that you inquired your way merely in order that you might see him." "Not him." "What then?" "The knee of his trousers." "And what did you see?" "What I expected to see." "Why did you beat the pavement?" "My dear doctor, this is time for observation, not for talk. We are spies in an enemy's country. We know something of Saxe-Coburg Square. Let us now explore the parts which lie behind it." The road in which we found ourselves as we turned around the corner from the retired Saxe-Coburg Square presented as a great contrast to it as the front of a picture does the back. It was one of the main arteries which conveyed the traffic of the city to the north and west. The roadway was blocked with the immense stream of commerce flowing in a double tide inward and outward, while the footpaths were black with the hurrying swarm of pedestrians. It was difficult to realize, as we looked at the line of fine shops and stately business premises, that we really abutted on the other side upon the faded and stagnant square which we had just quitted. "Let me see," said Holmes, standing at the corner and glancing along the line. "I should like just to remember the order of the houses here. It is a hobby of mine to have an exact knowledge of London. There is Mortimer's, the tobacconist, the little newspaper shop, the Coburg branch of the City and Suburban Bank, the vegetarian restaurant, and McFarland's carriage building depot." And that's where I will stop today, guys. Thank you for listening. I hope everyone has a great day, and I will see you all next time.